I thought catching him cheating would be the worst moment of my life, but I was wrong. It was the moment I stopped being the girl everyone thought they could break. The room smelled like expensive cologne and cheap lies, the kind that cling to your skin long after the truth shows up uninvited, and there I was, standing in the doorway of what was supposed to be my future, watching my fiancé forget I existed like I was nothing more than background noise in his perfect little life, his hand on her waist, her laugh soft and careless, like she had already won something I didn't even know we were competing for, and the strangest part wasn't the betrayal, it was the silence inside me, no screaming, no tears, just this cold, steady realization settling in my chest like something permanent, something dangerous, because in that moment I didn't feel broken, I felt clear, clearer than I had in years, like I had finally woken up from a dream I didn't realize was suffocating me. I didn't confront him, didn't slam doors or demand explanations, I just turned around and walked out, my heels echoing against the marble floor like a countdown to something I couldn't name yet, something irreversible, and by the time I reached the street, the night air hit my face sharp and unforgiving, New York buzzing around me like nothing had changed, taxis rushing past, people laughing, life moving forward without permission, and I realized that was the problem I had been waiting for. Permission my whole life, to be loved, to be chosen, to matter, and suddenly I didn't want that anymore, I wanted control. That's when I saw the car, black, polished, parked like it owned the entire block, and beside it stood a man who didn't belong to this world or maybe owned more of it than anyone else ever could, tall, composed, silver threading through his dark hair, his presence quiet but undeniable, like gravity, and when his eyes met mine, something shifted, not in the world, but in me, like I had just stepped into a different story without realizing it, one where I wasn't the victim anymore. "You look like someone who just lost everything," he said, his voice low, measured, not curious, just certain, and I should have walked away, any sane person would have, but I didn't, because he wasn't looking at me with pity, he was looking at me like he already understood the ending before I even knew the beginning, and for the first time that night, I felt seen, not as the girl who was cheated on, not as someone fragile, but as someone standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything. Or maybe, I said, my voice steadier than I expected, someone who just stopped pretending. There was a pause, not awkward, not uncertain, just quiet, like something was being calculated, weighed, and then he nodded slightly, almost to himself. "Good," he said. "Because I don't deal in illusions." I didn't know his name yet, didn't know the stories whispered about him in rooms I'd never been invited into, didn't know that people crossed the street to avoid men like him, but I knew one thing, standing there under the cold glow of streetlights, my heart finally beating for something other than survival, I wasn't afraid, and that should have terrified me more than anything. "Marry me," he said, just like that, no build-up, no explanation, the words landing between us like something already decided, and any other time, any other version of me would have laughed, would have walked away, would have called him insane, but I wasn't that version anymore, not after what I had just seen, not after what I had just lost, because in that moment, I didn't hear a proposal, I heard an opportunity, a way to take everything that had been taken from me and turn it into something sharp, something powerful, something mine. I looked at him, really looked, at the control in his posture, the quiet authority in his eyes, the kind of man who didn't ask twice, and I made a choice that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about love, about power, about myself. "Okay," I said. And just like that, I stepped into a life I fully intended to destroy. The next morning felt unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life and forgot to ask how to get back, except I did not want to go back, not to the girl who stood frozen in a doorway while her future slipped through her fingers, not to the version of me who thought love meant being chosen instead of choosing herself, and as the city woke up outside my apartment window, sunlight cutting through the glass in sharp lines, I realized I had not slept at all, my mind replaying his voice over and over again, calm, certain, as if what he offered was not absurd but inevitable. "Marry me." Two words that should have sounded like a joke but instead felt like a door I had already walked through. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, his number saved without me remembering doing it, just a name that carried weight even in silence, Victor Moretti, and I stared at it for a full 5 seconds before answering, my heartbeat steady in a way that did not match the situation at all. "You said yes," he said, no greeting, no hesitation, just a statement, like he was confirming a contract rather than a conversation. "I did," I replied, my voice quiet but firm, and there was a pause on the other end, not surprise, not doubt, just acknowledgement. "Good," he said. "Be ready in 30 minutes. The line went dead before I could ask anything else, and I stood there in the middle of my apartment, surrounded by half-packed wedding decorations and unopened gifts that suddenly meant nothing, realizing that my life had just shifted on an axis I could not see. 30 minutes later, I was in the back of that same black car, the leather cool against my skin, the city passing by in blurred reflections through tinted windows, and no one spoke, not the driver, not the man sitting beside me, Victor himself, his presence filling the space without effort, his posture relaxed but controlled, like everything around him moved according to rules I had not learned yet. "There are conditions," he said finally, his voice low, measured, and I turned slightly to face him, studying the lines of his face, the quiet authority in his eyes, trying to understand what kind of man makes an offer like this and expects it to be accepted. "Of course there are," I said, because nothing about this was free, nothing about him suggested generosity without purpose. "No lies," he continued. "No pretending. You live your life. I live mine. We do not interfere unless necessary." It sounded simple, almost too simple, like he was stripping something complicated down to its bones, and I felt a strange sense of relief settle in my chest, because for the first time in a long time, there were no expectations of romance, no illusions to maintain, just truth, sharp and clean. "And what do you get out of this?" I asked, because that was the only question that mattered, and his gaze shifted to me, steady, unreadable, but not cold. "Peace," he said after a moment. "And something else I will explain when it becomes relevant." That answer should have unsettled me, but it did not, because I was not here for answers, I was here for control, for the chance to take something broken inside me and reshape it into something stronger, something that could not be dismissed or replaced. The car slowed, turning into a private driveway that stretched longer than a football field, leading to a house that looked less like a home and more like a statement, clean lines, towering windows, everything precise and intentional, and as the gates closed behind us with a quiet finality, I felt it, the shift, the moment where there was no going back, where the girl who walked out of that apartment last night no longer existed. Victor stepped out first, adjusting his jacket with effortless precision, then turned slightly, offering his hand, not as a gesture of affection, but as acknowledgement, like he understood exactly what this moment meant. I looked at his hand, then at him, and for a second, just 1 second, I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life, but then I remembered the look on my fiancé's face, the indifference, the way I had disappeared in my own story, and something inside me hardened in response. I placed my hand in his. "Let us make this official," he said, and as I stepped out of the car and into his world, I made a promise to myself that I did not say out loud, not yet, not where he could hear it, because this was not about love, not about healing, not about anything soft or forgiving. I was here to break something. I just had not realized yet what that something would be. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes, and somehow that made it feel more real, not less, because there were no flowers, no music, no smiling guests pretending to believe in something fragile, just a quiet room, a man who had seen more years than I had lived, and a piece of paper that carried more weight than any promise I had ever heard before, and when I signed my name, my hand did not shake, not even a little, which scared me more than anything else, because it meant I had already crossed a line inside myself that I could not uncross. Victor stood beside me the entire time, not touching me, not guiding me, just present, his silence louder than anything anyone could have said, and when it was done, when the official looked up and said the words that made it binding, I expected something to change, some dramatic shift in the air, but nothing happened, the world did not pause, the ground did not move, it was just done, clean and final, like a decision that had been waiting for me long before I realized it. "You can still walk away," he said as we stepped outside, his voice calm, almost indifferent, like he was offering me an exit he did not expect me to take, and I looked at him, really looked this time, at the lines time had carved into his face, at the control in the way he carried himself, at the absence of anything that looked like regret, and I shook my head slowly. "No," I said, because walking away would mean going back, and I was not that person anymore. The drive back to the house was quieter than before, if that was even possible, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled because it already says everything, and I found myself watching him out of the corner of my eye, trying to understand what I had just attached myself to. What kind of man builds a life so controlled that even a marriage feels like a calculated move rather than an emotional one? When we arrived, the staff was already waiting, lined up with quiet precision, their eyes respectful but distant, like they had seen things they did not speak about, and I realized something then: this was not just a house, it was a system, a world that operated on rules I did not know yet, and I had just stepped into it without asking for a map. "They will take care of anything you need," Victor said, gesturing slightly toward the people who now belonged to my daily life, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when you realize you are no longer in control of the environment around you, only your place within it. "I do not need anything," I replied, maybe a little too quickly, and his eyes shifted to me, not challenging, not dismissive, just observing, like he was taking note of something important. "Everyone needs something," he said quietly. "The question is whether they admit it." I did not answer that, because admitting anything right now felt like weakness, and weakness was exactly what I had come here to destroy, starting with myself if I had to. He nodded once, like he understood more than I wanted him to, then turned and began walking toward the house, expecting me to follow, not asking, not checking, just knowing I would, and that certainty irritated me more than it should have, because I did not belong to him, not really, not in the way people would assume, and I needed to prove that, not to him, but to myself. So I stopped. Just for a second, just enough to break the rhythm he had already established, and when he realized I was no longer beside him, he paused, turned slightly, his expression unchanged but his attention fully on me. "There are rules, right?" I said, my voice steady, controlled, and he watched me for a moment before answering. "There are always rules." I took a breath, feeling the weight of everything I had just done pressing down on me in a way that felt almost physical. "Then I will break them," I said, not loudly, not dramatically, just a statement, simple and clear, and for the first time since I met him, something shifted in his eyes, not anger, not surprise, something else, something sharper, more interested, like I had just become a variable he had not accounted for. "We will see," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that felt less like a warning and more like an invitation, and as I walked past him into the house that was now mine as much as it was his, I realized something that settled deep in my chest like a quiet truth: I did not come here to survive this life, I came here to change it, even if it meant breaking the man who thought he had already seen everything. The first night in that house did not feel like a beginning, it felt like a test I had not studied for, every hallway too quiet, every surface too perfect, like nothing had ever been out of place here and nothing ever would be unless someone like me decided to change that, and I stood in the center of a bedroom bigger than my entire apartment, staring at a bed that looked untouched, like it belonged in a magazine rather than a life, and I realized something simple but unsettling: there was no trace of him in this space, no personal items, no photographs, no signs that a man actually lived here, just precision, control, absence. I dropped my bag on the chair without caring about the way it disrupted the clean lines of the room, a small act, barely noticeable, but intentional, because if this place was built on order, then disorder would be my language, and I needed him to understand that I was not here to fit into anything he had already designed. Hours passed without seeing him again, which should have made me feel relieved, but instead it made me restless, like I had stepped into a game where the other player had not made a move yet, and I hated not knowing the rules, hated not knowing what he expected, even though he claimed there were none beyond honesty and distance. So I went looking for him. The house was quieter at night, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, broken only by the faint hum of something mechanical in the walls, and I followed instinct more than direction, moving through long corridors until I found light spilling from a room at the end, warm and steady, like it had been there long before I arrived and would remain long after. He was inside, seated behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from something older than the house itself, papers spread out in perfect alignment, his reading glasses resting low on his nose as he looked up the moment I stepped into the doorway, like he had known I would come even before I decided to. "You are awake," he said, not surprised, just observant, and I leaned against the frame, arms crossed, refusing to step fully into his space. "So are you," I replied, and for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us in a way that did not feel empty, just measured, like something was being built without words. "Could not sleep," he added after a moment, setting the glasses aside with deliberate care, and I watched the movement, the control in something so small, wondering if he approached everything this way, precise, intentional, leaving nothing to chance. "Neither could I," I said, because lying was not an option here, not if I wanted to play this game on equal ground. He nodded once, like that confirmed something for him, then gestured slightly toward the chair across from him. "Sit," he said, not a command, not exactly, but not a suggestion either, and I hesitated just long enough to make it clear that I was choosing to comply, not obeying, before stepping forward and taking the seat, my movements slower than necessary, deliberate in their own way. Up close, the details were sharper, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the steadiness in his gaze, the absence of anything impulsive, and I realized he was studying me the same way, not judging, not dismissing, just observing, like I was a problem he intended to solve eventually. "Why me?" I asked, the question finally surfacing because it refused to stay buried, and he did not answer right away, his fingers tapping once against the desk before going still again, as if even that movement had been calculated. "Because you did not cry," he said finally, and the answer caught me off guard in a way I did not expect, because it was not what I had prepared for, not about convenience or appearances or strategy, something else, something quieter. "That is not a reason to marry someone," I replied, my voice steady but sharper now, and he held my gaze without flinching. "It is when you understand what it means," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke, not cold, not warm, just certain, like he had seen too many people fall apart to ignore the ones who did not. I exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair, trying to decide if that answer made him more dangerous or less predictable, and realizing it was probably both. "You think you understand me," I said, and he shook his head once, subtle, controlled. "No," he corrected. "I think you are trying very hard not to be understood." That landed somewhere deeper than I wanted it to, and I looked away for a second, just a second, before forcing myself to meet his eyes again, because losing ground here was not an option, not when I had just started this. "You should not assume things," I said quietly, and he almost smiled, not fully, just enough to shift the air between us. "Neither should you," he replied, and something in that moment changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that I felt it, like the first crack in something solid, and I realized with a clarity that settled in my chest like a warning, this was not going to be as simple as breaking him, because somewhere along the way, he might start breaking me back. The next morning arrived without permission, sunlight cutting through the tall windows like it owned the place more than I ever could, and I woke up disoriented for half a second before everything came back, sharp and immediate, the house, the silence, the man I had married like it was a decision instead of a reaction, and I sat up slowly, my body heavy with a kind of exhaustion that sleep had not fixed, my mind already racing ahead to the next move because standing still in a place like this felt like losing ground. The closet was filled with clothes that were not mine, perfectly tailored pieces in neutral tones, dresses that fit like they had been measured against me before I even arrived, and I ran my fingers along the fabric, feeling the weight of something intentional behind it, like he had prepared for this outcome long before I said yes, and that realization made something tighten in my chest, not fear, not quite, but awareness again, sharper this time, because I was starting to understand that nothing about Victor Moretti happened by accident. I chose a simple outfit anyway, something that felt like me, or at least the version of me I still recognized, and when I stepped into the hallway, the house was already awake in its quiet way, staff moving efficiently, voices low, everything functioning like a system that did not need direction because it already knew what to do. Breakfast was set in a dining room that felt too large for two people, sunlight reflecting off polished surfaces, everything arranged with precision that bordered on intimidating, and he was already there, seated at the head of the table, reading something on a tablet, his posture relaxed but deliberate, like even stillness was a choice for him. "Good morning," he said without looking up immediately, and I paused at the doorway for just a second, noticing the way he acknowledged my presence without needing to turn, like he was always aware of his surroundings in ways I had not learned yet. "Morning," I replied, taking a seat across from him, not at his side, not within his space, because distance was still something I needed, something that reminded me I had not disappeared into this life completely. The food was untouched, perfectly plated, but I did not reach for it right away, instead watching him, waiting for something, anything that would tell me how this was supposed to work beyond the rules he had already given me. "You are studying me," he said calmly, finally setting the tablet down, and I did not deny it because there was no point. "I am trying to understand what I married," I answered, my voice steady, and his eyes met mine, not offended, not amused, just attentive. "And what have you concluded so far?" he asked, and I leaned back slightly, considering the question more seriously than I expected. "That you do not do anything without a reason," I said, and he nodded once, like that was the correct answer but not the complete one. "That is true," he replied. "But neither do you." That caught me off guard again, the way he turned things back toward me so easily, like he was not just observing but actively dismantling the assumptions I brought with me, and I felt that familiar irritation rise, not because he was wrong, but because he was too precise. "I told you my reason," I said, sharper now. "I needed an exit." He watched me for a moment, his expression unchanged, and then he shook his head slightly. "No," he said quietly. "You needed control." The word landed heavier than I expected, because it was closer to the truth than I had been willing to admit, and for a second, I did not respond, just held his gaze, refusing to look away even as something unsettled shifted inside me. "And you think this gives me that?" I asked, my voice lower now, more measured, and he leaned back in his chair, studying me in a way that felt less like analysis and more like patience. "I think it gives you a choice," he said. "What you do with it is up to you." I exhaled slowly, glancing down at the untouched plate in front of me, then back at him, realizing that this was not going to be a straightforward battle, not something I could win by simply pushing against him, because he was not pushing back, not in the ways I expected, and that made him harder to predict, harder to break. "Then I will make my own rules," I said finally, the words quiet but deliberate, and he held my gaze for a second longer before nodding once. "I would expect nothing less," he replied, and there was something in his tone, not approval, not challenge, something else, something that felt dangerously close to respect, and as I reached for the coffee in front of me, the warmth grounding me in a moment that felt too controlled, too balanced, I realized something that settled deep in my chest like a quiet warning. I had come here to disrupt his world, but somehow, without realizing it, he had already started changing mine. By the afternoon, I realized something unsettling about the house. It did not react to me, no matter what I did, no matter where I went, everything remained exactly as it was, untouched, unaffected, like I was moving through a space that had already decided I did not matter enough to disrupt it, and that irritated me more than I expected, because I had not come here to be invisible, I had come here to change something, to leave a mark, even if it was small at first. So I started small. I moved things, not dramatically, just enough to notice if someone was paying attention. A vase slightly off-center, a chair pulled at an angle instead of perfectly aligned, a book placed on a table that had been empty before, and then I waited, watching, expecting correction, expecting someone to quietly fix it, to restore the order I had disturbed, but nothing happened, not from the staff, not from him, and that silence felt deliberate, like a response in itself. It was not until later that evening that I understood why. I found him again in the same room as the night before, the light warm, the air still, as if time moved differently here, and this time I did not hesitate at the doorway. I walked in without waiting, without asking, and he looked up immediately, his attention locking onto me with that same quiet intensity that made it impossible to pretend I was unnoticed. You have been rearranging things, he said, not as a question, and I felt something shift in my chest, a small spark of satisfaction that he had noticed after all. Does it bother you? I asked, stepping closer, testing the space between us, and he watched me for a moment before answering, his expression unchanged. No, he said simply. It tells me you are trying to find your place. That answer caught me off guard in a way I did not like, because it reframed what I thought was disruption into something softer, something almost reasonable, and I shook my head slightly, refusing to let him define my actions. I am not trying to fit in, I said, my voice steady, and he nodded once, like he expected that response. No, he agreed. You are trying to prove that you do not have to. The accuracy of that landed harder than I wanted it to, and for a second, I did not speak, just held his gaze, refusing to look away even as something unsettled moved beneath the surface. You make a lot of assumptions, I said finally, quieter now, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Only when they are correct, he replied, and there it was again, that quiet confidence that made it difficult to push against him in the way I had planned, because he was not reacting the way I expected, not controlling, not correcting, just observing, allowing, and that made every move I made feel exposed, like I was revealing more than I intended. I crossed my arms, shifting my weight slightly, trying to regain some sense of control in a conversation that kept slipping into his rhythm instead of mine. Then let me be clear, I said, my voice firmer now. I am not here to belong to anything, not this house, not your world, not you. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and deliberate, and for a moment, he said nothing, just watched me, his expression unreadable, his silence stretching long enough to make me aware of my own breathing. Then he stood. Slowly, deliberately, the movement controlled in a way that made the room feel smaller, not because he was imposing, but because his presence shifted the space itself, and he stepped closer, not invading, just enough to close the distance between us to something more direct. I did not ask you to belong, he said quietly, his voice lower now, more focused, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, not exactly, but awareness again, sharper this time. I asked you not to pretend. I held his gaze, refusing to step back, even as the air between us felt heavier, more charged than before, and for the first time, I realized that this was not about control in the way I had imagined, not about dominance or submission, but something else, something quieter and more dangerous, because it required honesty in a place where I had planned to hide behind intention. Then do not pretend either, I said, softer now but no less certain, and his eyes shifted slightly, just enough to tell me I had reached something real. I never do, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it meant every word, every action, every silence had been exactly what it appeared to be, no games, no manipulation, just truth, and that made him harder to fight, not easier. I exhaled slowly, stepping back this time, not because he forced me to, but because I needed space to think, to recalibrate, to understand the kind of ground I was standing on, and as I turned toward the door, I felt it again, that quiet shift inside me, subtle but undeniable. Like something I had been certain of was starting to change shape without my permission. This is not going to go the way you think, I said without turning back, the words more for myself than for him, and behind me, his voice followed, calm, certain, unchanged. It already is not, he said, and that was the moment I realized I was no longer the only one setting the terms of this game. I told myself I would not think about him, not about the way he spoke like he already knew the answers to questions I had not asked yet, not about the way he watched me without trying to control me, because that was not part of the plan. None of this was supposed to feel complicated, it was supposed to be simple, calculated, a temporary arrangement with a clear objective, but the problem with clarity is that once it cracks, everything underneath becomes impossible to ignore. The next day, I left the house. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see if I still could, if the gates would open without question, if the world outside would feel the same, and when the car pulled away from the long driveway, the city came back into focus like something familiar but distant, the noise, the movement, the unpredictability, all of it hitting me at once, and for a moment, I felt normal again. Like I had not made a decision that separated me from everything I used to understand. I walked without a destination, past coffee shops and storefronts, people moving around me without knowing who I had become overnight, and there was something strangely comforting about that, the anonymity, the absence of expectation, until I saw him. My former fiancé. Standing across the street like nothing had changed, like the last time he saw me was not in a moment that should have ended everything, and for a second, I froze, not because I missed him, but because I realized I felt nothing, not anger, not sadness, just distance, like he belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed. He saw me a second later, his expression shifting from confusion to something else, something uncertain, and he crossed the street quickly, calling my name like he still had the right to it. "Emily, wait," he said. Reaching me with a breathless urgency that would have meant something before, but now it just sounded misplaced, and I turned to face him slowly, my posture calm, controlled, the same way Victor stood, the same way he occupied space without asking for permission, and I realized I had learned something without trying. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady, and the question seemed to catch him off guard, like he expected emotion, expected a reaction he could work with, and when it did not come, he faltered. "I was going to call you," he said, his tone softer now, careful, like he was trying to rebuild something fragile, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, the timing, the attempt, the assumption that I would still be waiting for an explanation that no longer mattered. "You should not," I replied, and his expression tightened slightly, confusion slipping into something closer to concern. "Emily, I made a mistake," he continued, stepping closer, lowering his voice like that would make the words more meaningful, and I watched him, really watched him this time, the way his hands moved when he spoke, the way his eyes searched mine for something familiar, and I realized something simple and final: I had outgrown him in a single night. "No," I said quietly. "You made a choice." The distinction hung between us, heavier than anything else he could have said, and for a moment, he had no response, just stood there, trying to process a version of me that did not match the one he remembered. "Then what is this?" he asked finally, his voice edged with frustration now, gesturing slightly toward the ring on my hand like it was a detail he had just noticed, and I followed his gaze briefly before looking back at him, completely steady. "This is me choosing something else," I said, and he shook his head, disbelief settling in, because he did not understand, could not understand, not without seeing the man behind the decision, the world I had stepped into, the shift that had already started inside me. "You are making a mistake," he said, and for the first time, there was something almost desperate in his tone, something that might have reached me before, but now it only confirmed what I already knew. "Maybe," I replied, my voice calm, almost indifferent. "But it is mine." I turned before he could say anything else, before he could try to pull me back into something I had already left behind, and as I walked away, I felt it, not relief, not regret, something quieter, something steadier, like I had just closed a door without needing to slam it. When I returned to the house, the gates opened the same way they always did, silent, precise, and as I stepped back inside, I found him exactly where I expected, not because I had seen him, but because I understood him a little better now, and when his eyes met mine, there was no question, no need to explain where I had been or what I had done, just that same quiet awareness, like he already knew something had changed. "You went back," he said, not accusing, just stating, and I nodded once, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "And I did not stay," I replied, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like that answer meant more than I realized, and as the silence settled between us again, I understood something that felt both unsettling and certain. I had come here to break him, but the first thing I had broken was everything that used to define me. I did not expect silence to feel this loud, but it did. It followed me through the house in a way that felt different now, not empty, not distant, but aware, like every step I took carried weight I had not noticed before, and I found myself slowing down without meaning to, my thoughts catching up to something I had been avoiding since the moment I said yes. He was still standing there when I returned, exactly where I left him, as if time had decided to move around him instead of with him, and there was something about that, something steady, something unshaken, that made it harder to hold on to the version of him I had created in my mind, the one I planned to break. You saw him, Victor said after a moment, his voice calm, certain, not asking, and I felt that familiar tension in my chest, not because he knew, but because he always seemed to know without needing proof, without needing explanation, like he was reading something beneath the surface I had not figured out how to hide. Yes, I replied, my voice quieter now, less guarded than before, and he watched me for a second longer, not pressing, not pushing, just waiting in a way that made the silence feel like a choice instead of an absence. And, he asked finally, simple, direct, and I exhaled slowly, leaning slightly against the table behind me, grounding myself in something solid as I tried to put into words something that did not feel as clear as I wanted it to be. Nothing, I said, and that was the truth, not the kind that needed explanation, just the absence of everything I thought I would feel, and his eyes shifted slightly, not surprised, not skeptical, just understanding in a way that made me uncomfortable because I had not invited it. That is not nothing, he said quietly, and I looked at him, meeting his gaze without deflection this time, because pretending felt pointless here, with him, in this space where everything real seemed to surface whether I wanted it to or not. It is to me, I replied, but even as I said it, I knew it was not entirely accurate, because the absence of feeling was its own kind of answer, its own kind of shift, and he seemed to recognize that before I fully did. You are letting go, he said, not as a conclusion, but as an observation, and the word settled into me in a way that felt both right and unsettling, because letting go was not part of the plan, it was supposed to be about holding on to something sharp, something that justified the decision I had made. I did not come here to let go, I said, my voice firmer now, trying to re-establish the ground I felt slipping, and he nodded once, like he understood the intention even if the reality was already changing. No, he agreed. You came here to take something back. That reframed everything in a way I had not considered, not revenge, not destruction, but reclaiming, and I felt that shift again, subtle but undeniable, like the story I thought I was writing had started rewriting itself without asking for permission. And what did you come here for? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out sharper than I intended, because for the first time, I realized I had never really asked, had never pushed past the surface of his reasons, his world, his decisions. He did not answer immediately, and that alone told me more than any words could have, because until now, he always had an answer, always something precise and controlled, but this time, there was a pause, a real one, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, less defined. Something I lost a long time ago, he said, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that settled between us, not heavy, but real, and I felt something in my chest shift in response, something I had not accounted for, because this was not the man I had expected to face, not someone who admitted loss without dressing it up as strategy or control. And you think you will find it here? I asked, softer now, and he looked at me in a way that felt different, not analyzing, not observing, just present, and for the first time, I saw something beneath the surface, something human, something unguarded in a way that made everything else about him make more sense. I think I already have, he replied, and the words landed in the space between us with a quiet finality that made it hard to breathe for a second, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily they could change everything if I let them. I looked away first, not out of weakness, but because I needed distance from that moment, from the way it shifted something inside me that I was not ready to face, and as I moved past him, back into the quiet of the house that no longer felt as cold as it did before, I realized something I had not planned for, something I had not prepared for. I had come here to destroy a man's world, but instead, I was starting to understand it, and that was far more dangerous than anything else. I used to think power looked loud, like control you could see, decisions that shaped everything around you, but I was starting to understand something different, something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself because it already knew what it was, and the realization settled into me slowly, like a truth I had been avoiding because it did not fit the version of this story I had planned to tell. The days that followed did not explode into conflict the way I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no attempts to control me, no invisible rules tightening around my choices. Instead there was space to move, to think, to exist without being watched in the way I had feared, and that space became something I did not know how to fight, because you cannot destroy something that does not resist you. I found myself changing without meaning to, not becoming someone new, but uncovering parts of myself I had buried under expectations I no longer carried, and it showed in small ways: the way I spoke, the way I moved, the way I no longer hesitated before making a decision, and he noticed all of it without saying much, his attention steady, present, but never intrusive, like he understood that growth is something you do not interrupt. One evening, I found him on the terrace, the city stretching out below like a living thing, lights flickering in patterns that felt distant and familiar at the same time, and I stepped beside him without announcing myself, the air cooler, quieter, carrying the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own thoughts more clearly than you want to. "You are different," he said after a moment, his voice calm, certain, and I looked at him, not defensive, not denying it, because there was no point pretending anymore. "So are you," I replied, and that was the truth, not in the obvious ways, not in anything visible, but in something deeper, something that shifted in the way he spoke, the way he paused before answering, the way he looked at me like I was not just a decision he made, but something that mattered beyond that. "I told you this would not go the way you expected," he said, his gaze returning to the city, and I leaned against the railing slightly, letting the silence settle between us again, but this time it felt different, not like a gap to fill, but like something we both understood without needing to say it. "I thought I came here to take control," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, and he nodded once, acknowledging the shift, without interrupting it. "And did you?" he asked, and I considered the question carefully, because the answer was not simple anymore, not something I could define in one word. "Yes," I said finally. "Just not in the way I expected." He turned slightly then, his attention fully on me, and there was something in his expression I had not seen before, not calculation, not distance, something steadier, something that did not need to be explained. "Control is not about forcing things to change," he said. "It is about choosing what you allow to stay." The words settled into me in a way that felt final, like the last piece of something I had been trying to understand without realizing it, and I exhaled slowly, the weight of everything that had brought me here shifting into something lighter, something clearer. "Then I am not here to destroy anything," I said, the realization forming as I spoke it, and he did not react immediately, just watched me with that same quiet attention that had changed more than I wanted to admit. "No," he said after a moment. "You are here to decide what deserves to exist." I looked out at the city again, the lights, the movement, the endless noise of a world that kept going no matter what decisions we made inside it, and I realized something that felt both simple and profound: I had not lost anything that night I walked away, I had found something, something I did not know I was allowed to have. "You could buy the whole world," I said softly, the words almost a reflection of everything I had seen since stepping into his life, and he did not deny it, did not confirm it, just waited, the way he always did. "But you chose not to change me," I continued, turning back to face him fully now, and for the first time, there was no distance in my stance, no need to prove anything, just clarity. "I did not need to," he replied, his voice quiet, certain, and I held his gaze for a second longer before nodding slightly, because I finally understood what that meant: not control, not power, something else entirely. "You did not raise your voice," I said, the words coming without planning them, shaped by everything that had happened since that first night. "You raised my standard." The silence that followed was not empty, it was complete, and for the first time since I made the most reckless decision of my life, I was not trying to break anything, not him, not myself, just standing there in a moment that felt real in a way nothing else had, understanding that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not destroy what hurt you, but become someone it can never touch again.